is Catherine Nastrom interviewing Pearlie Dove for the Georgia Government Documentation Project and the Southern Oral History Program. Today is April 9th, 1992. I'd like to begin, if we can, by having you describe your career for us.
Even though the majority of my work experience was in the field of education as an instructor, supervisor of student teaching, and department chair, I feel that the frontline position in the field of education is teaching. During the evening tide of my career, the last year and a half before retiring to be exact, I returned to full-time teaching. I've been fortunate to always have a solid support group in my career, that is family, teachers, and professional peers. However, the late Dr. Dean A. McFeeters, who recruited me to come to Clark in 1949, had tremendous impact on my career. He believed in the positive impact of education, motivated faculty members to compete with themselves rather than each other, set worthwhile goals, and we worked as a team to strengthen the college in particular and the Department of Education specifically. Whatever idea a faculty member proposed, if he thought it was worthwhile for the university, he supported it. During my matriculation at the University of Colorado, I enrolled in a class entitled The Profession of Teaching. The instructor of the class was the late Dr. Reese Hughes, who was one of the architects of an organization called the National Council for Accreditation of Teacher Education, simply referred to as NCATE. This group set up criteria for approving teacher education programs of quality for schools meeting these standards. Graduates of these programs would have reciprocity in about 30 states. That is, they would not have to take additional courses for certification. As soon as I was appointed chairwoman of the Department of Education by Dean McFeeters, I solicited the assistance of my colleagues in working for NCATE accreditation. It was in 1975 that Clark received this accreditation and became the first black private college in Georgia to be so recognized. The institution's accreditation was renewed in 1985 and extended through 1991. Of course, my tenure with the university ended the year the accreditation was given. Also in Dr. Hughes' class, The Profession of Teaching, I realized how important it was for teachers to engage in professional organizations in order to upgrade teaching as a first-rate profession. Soon after, the Topeka-Brown decision rendered separate but equal practices in education illegal. Many professional groups that had been separate, that is, white units and black units, put in motion policies to comply with the new law. You can stop me anytime. I joined the Association of Student Teachers, now the Association of Teacher Educators, ATE, and became active working and holding offices in both the state and national units. After rendering more than 25 years of service with this group, including serving on its National Executive Committee from 1970 to 1973, I was chosen a distinguished member in 1983. It was a most humbling experience to join the roster with such nationally renowned educators as William Bagley, Margaret Lindsay, Florence B. Stratemeyer, all of Teachers College, Columbia University. All of my professional experiences with organizations were both challenging and rewarding. However, having been elected to the Board of Directors of the American Association of Colleges of Teacher Education, 1972-1975, and appointed to the Commission on Multicultural Education in 1970 was the most far-reaching. The reason is that while a member of this commission, one of the most important statements on multicultural education was crafted. No one model America, a statement on multicultural education. My personal experiences with professional organizations encouraged me to motivate teacher education students during their undergraduate years to become involved. The Student National Education Association, now the Clark College chapter of the Georgia Student Association of Educators, was chartered in 1964. Promoting high scholarship achievement to dispel the myth, those who can't teach. An honorary education society was formed in February 1982. There were 14 charter members and 2 faculty members inducted into Phi Delta Kappa Honorary Education Society by members of the Georgia State University chapter. The group is still very active in promoting academic excellence among teacher education students at Clark and Lane University. When I returned to full-time teaching a year and a half prior to retirement and having held the post Distinguished Professor of Higher Education for 22 years, one of my greatest joys was having been honored by the education students during their American Education Week celebration in 1985. I was chosen as a teacher worthy of emulation. Paraphrasing the works of the late Raleigh Sterling of the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and also a distinguished member of the Association of Teacher Educators. He says, a farmer takes pride in a harvested crop, an industrialist in a manufactured product, an artist in a finished masterpiece, and a musician in a completed score. But the teacher, unlike all of these, takes pride in the contributions made to the lives of the young people he or she has influenced to become productive citizens. Now, if you want me to bring out any other specific quick facts, I will be happy.
I'd like to have you run through the chronology of your career at Clark,
Okay.
The years that you worked in these different capacities.
Okay, let me go get my little beater because I don't remember.
Let's start with your own educational experience.
I finished Booker T. Washington High School in 1937, which was the only public school for blacks to offer high school training. We were very fortunate to have a very interesting principal whom I think was a person who offered programs that we are now reinventing. For example, he took the students who had received honors in the 11th grade on a tour up the East Coast. He made arrangements with all of the colleges along the way to house us and show us around these institutions so we would have some feel of the kind of educational opportunities outside of the city of Atlanta. I can recall a visit to Hampton University, which was the most beautiful college in Virginia. We went to Howard University, Johnson C. Smith, and also while in New York, it was my first trip there, and it was just a fabulous experience as we looked at the opportunities that were afforded people of color, though minimal, more extensive than we had in the South. Washington, D.C. was quite an inspiration as we looked at the Jefferson Monument. We went to Smithsonian Institute. We went to the homes of some of the former graduates who had moved to the area, and they carried us on field trip. And I guess going to Coney Island was quite a trip for me. And when I got on some of the fun, I guess you would call them rides, I was yelling so out of fear and fright. And someone said, we know they must have come from down south. Once on land, we got our composure back, and we went on with more, with things of more educational activities, I would state it that way. But I believe it opened up a whole avenue that the world was a little bigger than Atlanta. Mm-hmm. In the 12th grade, we went to Chicago by the way of Kentucky. I remember climbing in the Mammoth Cave of Kentucky and seeing the various works of nature. We went to the Chicago Art Institute when we arrived there. We visited the University of Chicago, and so its massive campus, which to us was out of this world. These two experiences, I think, opened up new vistas for those of us who were in this class, and we worked very hard to receive honors at graduation so that some of the schools would offer us scholarships to attend. Unfortunately, my mother was a single parent, and she did not have the money to send me away to school. However, I had a cousin who graduated from Clark College in 1931, and as is the custom of our family, we have to go to all of the graduations, weddings, baptisms, and so forth. And as I stood on Clark campus and watched her march into the chapel and then took my seat, I thought it was one of the most beautiful experiences I had had in my life. And I said, I want to come to this institution to matriculate as an undergraduate student.
Did you, before that, plan to go to college? Was C.L. Harper had planted a seed in your mind before that, or was this more the turning point for you?
No, I came from a family, and I had been indoctrinated that the only way you could go was to college. However, the reinforcement and the kind of inspiration we received from Mr. Harper and the teachers just gave us more momentum to go to college. My auntie was the principal of the school. My other auntie was a first grade teacher who, after retiring at 65 from the Atlanta Public School, was recruited by Our Lady of Lourdes to teach at the Catholic school until she was almost 75. I was surrounded by a number of teachers because they were my auntie's friends who were always in and out of the home, and education was a priority of my family. It's one of the things that you were just expected to do. But the place that you selected was left up to you, and the only limitation was the financial resources. But I did receive a scholarship to Clark, but even on my mother's salary, which was very limited at that time, it was a struggle to get through.
Did you work at the same time where you were in school?
My father, who was wounded in the First World War, had to spend a great deal of time in Tuskegee Institute Hospital, which was the only hospital available for blacks at that time. And after having seen Miss Evers' boys, I can understand the unhappiness he felt at that particular community. He died just at that time, and my mother received benefits that helped, and this was the reason I did not have to work in order to make ends meet.
And what years were you at Clark?
I was at Clark from 1937 to 1941.
And what did you take your bachelor's degree in?
I had a double major in home economics and elementary education.
And did you stay on immediately for your master's?
I had started school very early, and when I finished college, I was not 21. It was very hard in those days for anybody to trust a person who was not 21. My mother happened to have had a friend who worked for the American Red Cross, and she told my mother that since she was receiving aid from the government, that she would receive funds for me to stay in school until I was 21. With the funds that my mother received, and a friend of mine who encouraged me to go to Atlanta University with her upon graduation to see if we could seek scholarship funds, I was able to immediately go into graduate school, and I finished in 1943 with a master's in elementary education.
In elementary education, right. Then if I remember correctly, there's one other big chunk of your education which took place at the University of Colorado. And I'd like to have you describe how that came to be.
I will describe how that came to be. It was a part of my next segment, but that's okay.
Okay.
That's okay. I guess I might start by personally, desegregation impacted on my pursuit of the doctorate degree. Because I entered the University of Colorado in the summer of 1954. The reason, as you know, blacks could not enroll in the majority of predominantly white southern colleges and universities. However, the southern states did offer tuition travel grants to blacks who qualified to enroll in these types of colleges and universities for advanced degrees. Halfway through the completion of my program of studies at University of Colorado, the state of Georgia opened up its historically white colleges and universities to the black students. I was permitted to complete my degree requirements at the University of Colorado because I had passed all of the prerequisites for graduation and was working on my thesis.
And it was 4 years that you went to University of Colorado?
That's an interesting statement.
Was it back and forth? Am I
No,
remembering?
what happened was my husband was killed in an automobile accident, and he had been a veteran of the war, and he had also the benefits of what we call the GI Bill of Rights. And just before he was killed, he decided that if I wanted to stay in college work, I needed to go on and get the doctorate. His plan was that since he had money from the GI benefits, he was going to Union Theological Seminary in New York, and I would go to Columbia. Of course, his death changed all of that. I was left with a brand new house with only one note having been paid, a baby, a mother who was failing in health, but I was determined to go on to graduate school. one day I was sitting in the library about a year after his passing, reading one of these professional magazines, and it had said that there were two colleges in the United States experimenting with offering doctorate degrees without you having to get a year off. One was the University of Pittsburgh, and the other was the University of Colorado. I immediately contacted these two colleges, and I did not know at the time that the University of Pittsburgh was not a residence college. Of course, when I received that information, that eliminated the University of Pittsburgh because I could not see myself with the amount of time I had to spend in the library walking through Pittsburgh trying to reach the institution.
Mm-hmm.
Then I wrote to the University of Colorado and told them my plight, and they said, well, it was possible, but it had to be decided on an individual basis. They gave me the opportunity to take 2 courses that summer and pass the preliminary entrance examinations. And if I was able to do that successfully, then they would work out a plan with me. And I was able to do that, and I did pass. And what the plan was that I would go at least 3 consecutive summers. I would also have to do a semester's work through correspondence, and of course meet all the other requirements.
Mm-hmm.
It took me 5 consecutive summers.
Okay.
That's where the 5 came in,
Right.
plus the writing of my thesis and passing backwards and forward during
Mm-hmm.
The years that I did that.
And other than the summers, you were back here in Atlanta.
I was back here in Atlanta borrowing every summer from the CNS Bank, now the nation's bank, because at Clark we worked on a 9-month salary.
Right.
I'm sure the CNS Bank was very sorry that I completed my work because I did not have to come up every summer to borrow enough money to pay for the subsidy. Of course, there were personal things in my bills because the tuition and a part of the travel was paid for by the state of Georgia. That was interesting too. At first, I was rejected by the Board of Regents for going to any college west of the Mississippi River. What had happened was, when this opportunity was opened up to black teachers, they decided to take advantage of the whole bit. They studied at the University of Mexico, the University of Colorado, the University of California. So by the time I got there, all of the travel funds had been used up, and this is why they did not want you to go west of the Mississippi. However, I'm a very persistent person, and I wrote Ms. Harris, and I told her how I felt. It was very awful for her to tell me that I could not go to the university of my choice for a legitimate reason when opportunities were denied me as a taxpaying citizen. I don't know whether she realized how persistent I was, but anyway, I kept writing, and I said, well, what is your problem? And that's when I learned about the travel fund. And I said, I'm sure we can work out a compromise. So the compromise was that my tuition would be paid, but my travel would be allocated on how much money it would cost to go to New York. I found out that they also considered Connecticut, so the next year I went up and asked them, could they give me $3 more if I'm going to Connecticut?
That's a very funny story. I just thought briefly before you mentioned a Miss Harris, and who was she?
She was the secretary to the Board of Regents, and her office it's right there where that there's a bend in Edgewood and a little street. Of course, they have have restored it, but she was the secretary to the Board of Regents, and she handled all of the
who oversaw this.
yeah.
Right. And when you finished, what you ended up with was an EDD?
EDD.
Okay.
That again, it's another story. I registered for the PhD degree in education. At that time, the University of Georgia did not offer a PhD degree in education. That came later. And I could not enter any degree program that was not offered by the University of Georgia.
Mm-hmm. So because they had an EDD, then that was the degree that you went.
They did have PhDs, but at that time not in education.
Not in education. Okay. I think here I'd like to continue on with something we started before, which is to then establish the years, exact years that you were working in different positions at Clark. And if I'm right, there were 3, the Director of Student Teaching,
Yeah.
and then you served as the Chair of the Department of Education, and then as Distinguished Professor of Higher Education.
Yeah.
And so what were those years?
The chronology of it was that I really became a teacher of education and director of student teaching from 1949 to 1963. I was elevated to the Distinguished Professor of Education in 1974, and I chaired the department from 1963 to 1985. Mm-hmm.
And so that last year that you referred to as teaching was the 85, 86 school year?
That's right.
Okay.
That comes back also to Dean McFeeters. Dean McFeeters said, it doesn't matter whether you administrate or not. It would be always good to teach one class. He said, that's what I'm going to do. So when I get ready to retire, I will just pick up my other 2 classes and go into full-time teaching. One of the advantages of continuing to improve your craft by teaching is the longer you're away from it, many of your skills are lost. You become more removed from the values of the students. So it wasn't that difficult for me to take up those 2 classes because I had always taught the Introduction to Education class, at least one class during all of my tenure. And as I said, I cite my mentor for having encouraged us, because a lot of people, when they get into administration, they don't want to teach. And I always taught a sophomore class every other year. Most of the senior professors preferred working with the senior students.
Did you enjoy working with the students who were just starting out?
I really liked it because as a chair of the department, I got a first-hand opportunity to meet the students, to observe them, to learn about their goals and aspirations, etc. And I think sometimes at the senior year, it's very hard to plan with them as well.
I wonder too, just as you were describing this meeting students when they were first starting out in their careers in teaching, you occupied the position of director of student teaching for so long. Did you see a change in students over that time? I'm thinking so much was changing around them in terms of the society they were living in.
I think one of the changes I did see, and I guess this was comparable in our whole society, when we came through college, our parents were very limited in means, and we were always conscious of how much they had sacrificed for us to get to this place, and time. During the civil rights era, when many loans, etc., were made available to students, there wasn't that consciousness that if I don't make it in this course,
Mhm.
you know, it's a disaster. I recall when I was in school, if you got less than a C, you hit it. You didn't want people to know it. And I would see students flitting around with a D, which was passing, as though it was a badge of honor. Uh, so I think it is the attitude that because they didn't have to work as hard as we did, or as the earlier generation, to get the education. And I suppose they did work, and we worked, but we worked for necessities. A number of kids today work to keep up their cars, you know, rather than because they have to work. And I think this limited them in terms of their focus. Even though we didn't have much money, but we did, some of my co-workers who did not receive government funding from their fathers did work in what we call the NY, I think it was the NY National Youth Administration. They got jobs of that nature. Scheduled so the students could also participate in extracurricular activities like the choir. I sang in the choir, in NAACP groups, in academic clubs, etc. These students could do these things, but because they are so busy working to take care of their cars, they miss the total offerings in terms of extracurricular as well as curricular experiences. And I think this is quite unfortunate. And the humanities, we were saturated with the humanities. For example, things were required. We had to go to chapel. We had to sponsor programs daily. We had to do these things. Today there are options other than for freshmen, and that's on a limited basis. And when these renowned speakers and people come to college campuses, the audiences are very, very sparse. And I think they are missing a great deal in the total, because some of the greatest lessons I learned was participating in extracurricular activities, such as when I served as the literary editor of The Mentor.
And did you did that in your years getting your master's at Clark?
No, I did this as an undergraduate.
Okay, so in the late 1930s is when you were doing this.
This was, I think, in '39 to be exact.
I wonder too, along that line of changes in the students, again, because you were working in teacher training for so long, did the makeup of the student body going into teaching change in terms of their economic background or the sex or any of those kinds of issues?
I think during the 70s, with the opening up of new career opportunities which blacks had been denied, teacher education, which was the largest department, moved to third place. Students were all going to be the next Monica Kaufman in the TV world. And all of those who weren't going into TV were going on to get their MBA so that they could be the entrepreneurs or the great corporate workers in the business world. So that composition did change. Think now that there is a move toward more and more students going into teaching, but for a while it was very, very tenuous.
You mentioned that as being a change that occurred in your eyes mainly in the 1970s.
I think that's when it began. For example, the late Dr. Henderson, and I will refer to him as we talked about things that people did at the university in politics, came to the university, and his whole thrust was to, I guess, have as his slogan, increasing the options. And that is when we expanded the idea of teaching 1 or 2 journalism classes to a major in mass communication. He also offered courses in the allied health professions, which we did not because this was opening up. So I think he too sensed the mood of the larger society, and he felt that if we were going to recruit students, we had to offer the kinds of opportunities that they were seeking, and of course their parents. I have had students who came to me and said, I want to be a teacher, but my mother is a teacher and she wants me to go into other fields because you don't get much money,
Right.
and all of the other reasons. So it did have its impact. We were able, however, with introducing some programs that came out in the early 70s, to hold a very good group of students. I'd like to mention one was the Career Opportunities Program, because it was a very good government-funded program, and also we had a relationship with Morris Brown and Georgia State. It was a program that they tried to recruit low-income parents who needed work and who had either finished high school or earned the GED as teacher aides in the schools in their various communities. And what they tried to do was to give these people an opportunity to earn a bachelor's degree program in a non-traditional curriculum. For example, they started their professional education courses first, the things that they needed to learn to function in the classroom working with the teacher. The government allowed a certain amount of money, which I can't recall. The tuition that they allowed was less than Georgia State required. But it wasn't enough for Clark. Georgia State cooperated by giving to Clark the overage that they had. And my president worked with some groups to take care of the slack because there was a great discrepancy. And we worked together and met together. And after those courses were offered, those people who wanted to go on and earn a degree, we offered in the evenings and on a full day, a full course load in the summer, general education courses and the specialized courses that they needed. But they did not have to start in general education as the average student because they were older women and most of them had families. We had about 65 people who, of the 150, to actually graduate in that program.
And this was all in the decade of the 1970s? Okay, and it was mainly women going through. Did I pick that up right?
But you picked it up. There were a few men,
Mm-hmm.
but the majority of them
Right.
were women.
And a lot of them returning students, or what we might
Some
now
of them
call-
had been college dropouts. Some of them had never been in college. They all were dedicated and sincere and worked even harder than my regular students, because at this point in their life they knew
Mhm.
the importance of education. I run across them occasionally now. Some of them have gone on and gotten their masters. Some of them are teaching in DeKalb, Cobb, and the Atlanta public school system.
That must be very rewarding to know that they've
It
gone
is.
out
Just
and
the
done
other
that.
day I was out to the doctor's office, and I came across one I had not seen since she graduated, but she recognized me and I recognized her.
Mm.
But the only thing that disturbs me about the government is whenever a program works,
Mm.
after 5 years, it was not funded. And unfortunately, our college did not have the resources, to pay these people, to go to school like this program did, plus take care of their tuition.
These students coming into this special program, so that was one change in the kind of student that you might have worked with
Yes, sir.
over time. But I'm wondering again if there was any other noticeable shifts in the kinds of students, or maybe the background that they came in. Part of the reason I ask is I tend to think when you started working at Clark, I would think that most people, I may be wrong, going into teaching would have been women. Was that correct?
Yes, and that has not changed.
Not changed.
There was one other difference. When and we were talking about this in my 1937 high school class, there wasn't the kind of open admissions that we have today. In fact, at the end of the sophomore year at Clark College at that time, and I guess this was common of many of the black universities, you were given an exit examination. And if you didn't pass this examination, you did not move up to the upper level, work for the college. And nobody sued you, and nobody, it was just understood. So the students who went through these programs took it very seriously. At the end of our college career, irrespective of whether we had passed every course with honors, we had a comprehensive examination that had to be passed before the AB degree was rewarded. With the open admissions and the amount of money in remediation that we give to students in college now, you find a lot of students who are serious, but you do find a greater number who don't take it that seriously. Another thing is we finished in 4 years. We had to. But today a student can take, 5 and 6 and 7 years, to complete the same course of study. Of course, as I said, there were other reasons. They work, they don't take it as seriously. In fact, we had an experimental program called the 13 College Program. And in this program, which made sense to me, a selected number of students, around 150 of them, were put in a program where they took only 4 courses each semester throughout their college career, rather than the model of students who were taking 5 and 6 courses in the regular program. What we did find, particularly as the backgrounds of students were changing. The students who took the 4 courses and worked at them religiously passed these 4 courses. Some of the students who were taking the 7 courses were not passing but 4 anyway. If you give a student who has a reading difficulty, philosophy, religion, English, history, science, and whatever, the chances of them, unless they were, honor students or very serious students, passing it. So I think one of the things in my generation, and I think I will have to also say that when I came along, you didn't have too much to do. I mean, you went to church on Sundays. You went to the theater if you went to church on Sundays, and you had most of your activities on the college campus. But today, the options in terms of recreation, the many pulls on students, TV, etc. I guess I'm not faulting the students altogether for whatever changes, because perhaps if I had to come through this generation and I had all of the options before me and the kinds of temptations, I think it does make a difference.
I think too that the changes that you're describing took place in a context where Atlanta changed
Yes.
a great deal
Yes.
as a city too.
Mm-hmm.
Just the very options that you were describing
Yeah.
before. So it was a very different place.
And we used to say there's Atlanta and then Georgia.
Mm-hmm. Which meant?
Which means that I would, go to places and travel, and people would, look at me sometimes when I was visiting in New York, and they, would think we were strange people down here. They didn't know we walked on sidewalks. They thought we were culturally deprived. And I told them that we were not culturally deprived, because when the Atlanta Symphony came when I was a junior at Clark College, and we couldn't go to the symphony, the board of the directors just had the symphony to come out to Clark and give us a concert. Even though we couldn't go to live theater, we had Ann Cook at the Atlanta University Center, who put on some of the most beautiful plays of Julius Caesar, as well as plays by black authors. And they played, it was almost like a professional cast. So we got the advantage, being in a university setting, of cultural activities in Atlanta that students in other Georgia towns and communities could not even envision.
I have a vague recollection that I've heard this somewhere before, that many, let's say, musicians or theater companies that came and performed, let's say, downtown, would a day later come and perform at Atlanta University. Is that
Yes,
that
I'm
correct?
saying that's why the trustees, on our boards, who at that time were predominantly white, knew what was going on in the community,
Mm-hmm.
and they thought it their responsibility, to make sure that we were not denied these kinds of experiences, which to me added a great deal of growth
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
in terms of my development.
When we were talking just a minute before about the changes in the student bodies that you worked with in your time at Clark, I thought that was a place to open up onto some of these other issues that we were going to talk about. But I thought first I'd ask, is there anything else you'd want to add of significance in your career that you think are important issues we should get down?
No, I think I sort of pulled out those that were, important
Okay.
as in terms of my perceptions.
Right, I'd like to move now into the discussion about school desegregation in Atlanta, and
Well, I would say that my first ideas about segregation in terms of how the communities accepted was following the Sibley hearings. I don't know whether you know about the Sibley
Yes.
hearings.
Yeah.
They went all over.
right, and this was in I guess they started in March of
Yeah.
1960.
Yeah.
Right in.
And it was to prepare the various communities in Georgia. The only thing that disturbed me about these hearings, they were held for the citizens to air their concerns relative to integration. And I guess teachers could attend, these town hall meetings as citizens, but to my knowledge, there were no similar forums to prepare the teachers, or students to address the issues of integration. Now, at the college level particularly, the students participated in, the sit-ins, the marches, the boycotts, and other, strategies, and they were really wanted to accelerate changing the system in communities where they were a little slow in integrating gracefully. Even the younger faculty members were quite involved in activities such as restructuring this curriculum that we were talking about to prepare students to enter these new job markets and expansion of traditional careers. And they also work with the students in trying to help them move in positive ways rather than burning and destroying property. I remember the late Carl Holman, who used to be with the Urban Coalition, and a number of faculties worked with those students and used their energies in preparing a page for the Constitution and journal to help the students to express their ideas about this great social phenomenon. Now, specifically, as a chair of the department, I was involved in placing black student teachers in schools which were predominantly white. And some of my teachers who were not as experienced as I was, and they did not want to take on this responsibility. And of course, they never had large groups anyway, so the small number, even as department chair, I could handle it. Recruiting these students whose experiential backgrounds with Caucasians was almost nil was not easy. And even when I found students who were willing to try this new experience, it was a difficult and complex task. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that I had learned by my work with the YWCA was to be able to discern which problems were really racist and which were human problems based on, I guess, a breakdown in communication. And I think this was really one of the hardest tasks, because in going around, there were some problems that I found were not racist, even though they were perceived as racist by the students or the teachers, but they were really human problems. And this, really it posed a great deal of skill in human engineering in this already volatile situation. However, with the passage of time, integration was moderately achieved. I don't think it's ever been achieved. And of course, desegregation followed it. And I say today we are now resegregated in the Atlanta school system. I can't think of one school that's North Atlanta, which was the combination of the North Side and North Fulton, that is really has any degree, a semblance of integration. Now, realizing this need to intensify the efforts to prepare student teachers for multiculturalism in schools, we did in the department make this our priority from about 65 to 71. In other words, we decided one of the things that we could do as a private college. I mean, we didn't have to have anybody to vote on this. We could just do it. And if I have time, I'd like to tell you about one program that we participated in that I think if this model had been used in other situations, it would have made for much better. This program began in 1971, and it was called the Southern Student Teachers Program. Now, the problem grew out of a problem of recruiting more black teachers to work in suburban Rochester, New York, or Monroe County. The Monroe County Human Relations Commission brought together a coalition of people, which in addition to the commission included the University of Rochester, staff in New York, the United Negro College Fund institutions, and Nazareth College of Rochester, New York. And they came together and designed a program with these objectives. First, they wanted to provide black college students with the stimulating student teaching experience in suburban white school districts. Second, they wanted to give prospective teachers, this is black teachers, an opportunity to discover what it would be like to teach in a northern, predominantly white, middle-class suburban community. And third, they wanted these students to also have the experience of participating in the social and cultural life of a predominantly suburban white middle class, which they couldn't have gotten in Georgia. And they also provided another incentive, and that was they would give these students scholarships to attend graduate school in the New York area if they so decided. Now, how did they raise funds? The funds for the plane fare for these Southern students were raised by the local school district of Monroe County, Rochester, New York, Rotarians and Friends. Room and board were provided for students in the homes of the people who lived in the community. And the supervision was done jointly by the staff from Nazareth College and the collective staff from the United Negro College Fund institutions. One, I think the desirable outcomes of this program was that 1/4 of the students in the program who remained in Rochester area were employed. They knew something about the community knew something about them, and they were employed. 1/4 of them did continue their education because it was an opportunity to get your master's in I think the University of Buffalo was one, but there were some targeted universities. And 1/2 of these students returned to their homes. I mean, it was a kind of 50-50, and found employment either at home or in other local communities. And what did I learn from this experience? I learned that if schools, that is public schools and departments of education, the community, were really serious about promoting multicultural experiences during the student teaching period, they can serve as a positive catalyst or seek out a group, like this Human Relations Commission did, in Loftus Carson was the black guy who was the catalyst of this group. And I believe this to me is the way we have to go. I mean, we have to bring people together from diverse situations who were all affected by this process, and work at it positively. One of the cutest experiences in Rochester, New York, suburban, was I had an art major who went there, and they told her during Black History Week that they wanted her to specifically, talk about Africa and so forth. And having come from small, impoverished communities in terms of materials and resources, she had made her little paper mache and all of these kinds of things. And so one of the little boys said, "Miss Smith, you don't have to do that." He said, "My daddy goes on a safari to Africa every year, and we have all of these things." And she said they brought more stuff. Here she was to the thing. But what I'm saying is it gave her an opportunity to see another setting where where the funds were not limited. These kids had traveled, their parents had traveled. Another one was I had a very excellent reading teacher named Ruby Dooley, and she tried to teach the children that the magic number of reading groups was not 3. And everywhere she sent the students here in our community in the South, there were 3 groups: the butterflies, the bees, and the birds. And they said, "Oh, Miss Dooley, no need you telling us about this kind of stuff." But when one of her students got to Rochester, there were 7 groups of reading, because they had parents who came in and volunteered. They had the resources and so forth. And she said, "Well, there are some places, but had she not had this experience, she would never have known that." Just in terms of school buildings, I had told my students that, the models that I came through, which are still in operation, where the first grade teachers herded all the children to go to the bathroom at the same time, as though, they had to excrete at the same time, and one little boy just couldn't make it. And when he got back into the classroom, he would raise his hand and say, "May I go to the bathroom?" And the teacher said, "You just came from the bathroom." And in this school that was designed by a parent who was an architect working with child development, and the first and second grade, the bathrooms were in the room.
Nearby.
Yeah, right in the room. And only thing the student knew, was to not disturb the other students, but just to just to excuse himself or herself and go. I said, this makes much more sense. But what I'm saying, when you're in a community where they have money, and they have parents who are willing to give their time in making the best educational, reiterating how important it is for students to have a variety of experiences. Students often accosted the members of the Department of Education in telling us a lot of the theory that we required them to learn was not relevant, and we had to let them know that you cannot look at the world through one model. There were many other models, and you have to search. And it was just like a doctor who didn't know but one pill, and if that pill didn't work and he kept giving it to you, you would finally peg out. And I said, by knowing a lot of models and having been, had these experiences, if one answer, did not work, you had something else to draw from. So that's why we think these experiences in a wide variety of settings were necessary. I think I might say that I can move into how I think school desegregation might have gone better. Uh, First, I think the foundation set by our national leaders was very weak in promoting integration. And the interaction between the government, civil rights groups, community members, uh, and education was one of fear, deception, and chaos. I want to cite an example. A high school student um, whose parents I knew, um, his father was employed as a caretaker of a 4-unit apartment complex. This student, without consulting his parents, believed that the landmark decision which eliminated the dual system was the law. He marched up to this newly integrated school, which I think was Grady High. He filled out papers to enroll because it was nearer to the white section where his father was living. His application through some underground railroad type of system was sent perhaps by courier to his father's employee. That evening his father was fired immediately, and he lost both his livelihood and housing, which was provided in his contractual agreement. And it has always disturbed me that because this innocent high school student was abiding by the law, a family was ruined. And there are stories like this throughout, I'm sure, the United States. When the members of the NAACP and teachers realized that families could be victimized if they tried, to enroll their children in recently desegregated school, they had to come up with another plan. So the next line of action the NAACP Black Teachers and Parents took was to target children from homes where their parents wouldn't be as vulnerable. They sought children of physicians, entrepreneurs, lawyers, black college professors and staff members, and those working for private organizations sympathetic to the cause. So because of the insincerity that was the underlying factor, I believe if there had been an all-out, sincere effort to make integration or desegregation work, these are some of the steps I believe should have been taken. 1, resource centers for training teachers and parents and community leaders in the skills necessary for working in multicultural school settings, multicultural and multi-ethnic school settings should have been put in place. I was speaking to you this morning. Isn't it ironic that in today's Constitution, a judge has ruled that all Benton State College officials will have to attend a course in race relations? Mm-hmm. How many years late are we in that kind of thing? Right. And I think if people learn to work together, to come together, and work out conflict resolutions to any problem before you get out into it, I think it would have been better. Secondly, the national government should have offered more positive support to local communities other than sending in troops to guard the schools and escort the children, which added more fuel to a fire in some instances. And as I looked during those days on the TV and saw, these big army type men escorting these little children in Louisiana, it was enough to really bring tears to your eyes. And I guess third, de facto segregation in 1954 and still in 1992 remains one of the most formidable deterrents to desegregation. Until the national government takes the leadership in correcting the inadequacies of forcing low-income parents to be concentrated in what we call red line district, school desegregation will never become a reality. And fourth, my famous example of coalitions based on the model of the Rochester student teaching program could have been used in many communities to advise people in how to bring groups together in order to prepare them for cross-cultural activities. And finally, my personal feeling is that the movers and shakers in the late 50s and early 60s, those in power did not really care whether desegregation worked or if there was quality education for all the children of all the people, because they had the resources and options to send their children to private schools.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you hear that very, very often, and people saying it very clearly.
Yeah.
I was so struck by your describing the Rochester model and the Southern students going up and experiencing that. Was there any effort, or do you see a way that that kind of model could have been applied here in Atlanta?
Yes, it could have been applied here in Atlanta, but it all is, the key is leadership. Mm-hmm. And those in power have to create a situation where people who want to do things can achieve it. And unfortunately, in Atlanta, which is comparable to most models, we have a top-down administrative model, and still do, where those who sit in power never consult the people who are in the trenches working with these problems in terms of what their feelings are. Mm-hmm. And I think that was the, and I mean, that has nothing to do with the South, but it's just an administrative model where those in the top have no idea of what is going on, in the world. And I think that was one of the things when I went to the breakfast, the Carter Project, and how ex-President Carter said he went to Grady Hospital, he saw this crack baby, and he went into what were the reasons that would cause this thing. I guess down in Plains, never, you have to work at these problems. You have to be in the trenches to know what is needed. Mm-hmm. And nobody even asked. Another example that I heard at a meeting was given by an educator who knew someone several years ago who was a vice president resigning from the Ford Motor Company. And this guy had told him just before he retired, he said, I learned a lot. He said, the persons who design these cars that make people unhappy, so they have to have a new model, every so many years, would sit up on the top floor of the executive and, just come up with all of these crazy ideas and never ask anybody down in the shop who had to put them together whether this would work. And he said that they would send it down there, and then they would waste all of this time, have to send it back. And say one man who was down in the trenches say, well, do you think it would be all right if, some representative can come up and work with you all while you're doing this, and we can tell you what will work? And he said, as a result, they did that, and it cut the production time and all of this, just because the people who had to do the job was consulted. Mm-hmm. And I think so many times, they're up here now with the parents and the board of the regents and everybody playing with sex education. and very little input has anybody asked the teachers, how do the kids feel about it? And I think this is, what is happening to us. In America, there are people now, there may have been a time when only the leaders were educated, but now you have a lot of people, on the teaching level who are educated and have ideas, who are never consulted about whether something will work or not.
Right. I'm thinking too about, you were describing the top-down model, and
Oh, yeah.
another model is a more.
Is a coalition or,
and a
the team.
collaborative, right. Were there, and then specifically on your expertise with teachers, were there teachers during the whole desegregation period in Atlanta who were putting forward ideas that were just not listened to?
I really, was not working with the public school
As
other
much.
than, in it. So I really can't say. But I will say this is, I talked to my daughter, and who is teaching in a middle school in an inner city neighborhood. And she says, well, there are certain things that I can't do. I say, why? And she said, the administration. I said, is there anything in the handbook that says you can't do this? And she said, no, I hadn't thought of it that way. But I think so many times teachers just assume that there are things that they can't do, because they have always been told what to do.
Right.
And once you begin to get in that mode, your initiative is crushed, etc. I know in most education departments and schools, when I came along, when I visited them as a high school student, when I went to them as a college and so forth, you would find that the education department suffered from inferiority complex. They were always in the oldest building. They had the worst equipment, and they were all complaining. But thanks to Dean McFeeters, he dispelled that mentality with us, and we just thought we were the greatest things in the world, and we never had that mentality. So it was our fortune to make sure that education, was on equal par. And if anybody else asked for anything, we asked for more. I mean, it was just the attitude, and I guess it was because of our leader. But I think that is a problem. Once people have been browbeaten into losing initiative, it's hard to come back after you've been teaching a number of years and recapture that kind of enthusiasm. One of the things that was a great loss in terms of my students to me was I had a girl named Evelina Bowman who came from Chicago. She was one of the most dynamic, energetic English teachers I had ever seen. And she went into the Board of Education, and she happened to have been in a situation that was just crushed all her creativity. And after 4 years, she left and joined her husband, who has a touring, service, travel agent and all. But the girl still loves education, and I ran across at a social science. It was a social science fair, and someone had dropped out, and they asked her to come and serve as a judge of some written works for social studies fairs because she was good in English. And I said, "Are you good?" She said, I just the things I wanted to do, and she's just a vibrant, dynamic person. And I said, we lose these kinds of people because they cannot, be stifled in creativity. And I think we need them. but until we are able to recruit or inspire more leadership at the top to trust the people at the bottom to make some decisions.
Right. When I asked you about the teachers before and school desegregation, it seems as though from what you're saying, they did not have a large input into
no.
how it progressed.
No.
What were teachers' concerns at this time? Was their daily life so wrapped up in large
They
classrooms?
were concerned in terms of lottery. You know, they were moving teachers by lottery to make up quotas.
Mm-hmm.
Where am I going? One very interesting student that I told, he finished Clark College. He had the same English professor I did, who was very renowned, Dr. Stelber Brooks. And of course, when you teach English, you have Shakespearean dramas that you like, and those that you discuss. So he said, he had always let students select what they wanted to study and so forth, and talked about him. And he said that one of his favorites was The Merchant of Venice. But he was at a predominantly black school. So when they moved him out the north side of that area, and there were a lot of Jews in the school, and he talked about The Merchant of Venice, which was not one of their popular. He said, had somebody prepared him that you need to study the culture before you do the things you like, he would have been better. But he finally, he was a bright fella, and he regrouped. But he said they needed that kind of, training for somebody to say, when you go into, a community, who are the persons, you don't want to offend. And so I'm thinking that it's still needed today, because we really don't know each other very well.
No, I agree in that sense. There's been relatively little change. You mentioned earlier, and I'm forgetting the exact context, but while we've been talking about school desegregation, the role of the NAACP, and I wondered about the interaction of teachers associations like the Gate City Teachers Association with what we think of as being civil rights organizations, and how much interaction there was there.
Well, in the black community, the teachers were the leaders, and they belonged to the NAACP. They belonged to the professional organizations. They were the ones who belonged to many, of the civil rights groups. However, they too could be scared off very easily. And I'll say that because one of the officers of my church, the late John Calhoun, was president of the NAACP, and he went to jail rather than to turn over to the city fathers a list of black teachers who were, involved in the NAACP. And of course, that in itself affected the membership in the NAACP, because the teachers were afraid. They just didn't know what would be their,
Right.
their plight. Because, you can understand the kind of climate, and I just happened to have, known him because he was a Sunday school superintendent when I was coming through, and I thought he was such a courageous man, because he said he was not going to sell his people out, and he would rather go to jail. And it takes real courage for people to do that, and you won't find too many people who will
Right.
take such a stand. Again, my ex-principal that I talked to you about, Mr. Lincoln Harper, became the executive director of the NAACP after he retired, and was very active in the equalization fight for teachers' salaries.
Right, and that was in the 1940s.
Mm-hmm.
Was he gone from the scene by the 1950s? I don't recall seeing that many references to him later on. I just may not know this for sure.
I believe he must have died in the late 40s or the early 50s because, from my recollection.
Do you think that might have been part of the reason that teachers were less well connected to the NAACP, or do you think the larger factor was what you were citing before?
I think it was all a combination, because Reeves, the guy who was the sacrificial lamb in the equalization fight for salaries, was a lonely man. The teachers for whom he sacrificed his professional career was afraid to even associate with him. Mm-hmm. This Underground Railroad of somebody telling somebody, we saw you, and in fact, his wife, the wife of the other one, Sam Davis, they never fired him, but what they did, they never gave him a raise in 17 years. Mm-hmm. But by him being a mathematician, he was able to do tax, income reports for teachers. He also could repair TVs and so forth, and these were the things that augmented his salary. Mm-hmm. And his wife belonged to our church, and it was a sad state, because I don't think people were conscious of it, but many of them were fearful. Of course, you always have that group of adamant people who say, I'm going to do what I want to do, mm-hmm. Irrespective of the consequences. But I do think that the climate itself
was so chilling at that time. Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. I wondered, this is sort of veering off in another direction, but again on this idea that you have of a more collaborative model where, for example, teachers would have been more consulted and also been better trained for the issues that they'd be facing in desegregated schools. And you mentioned the Rochester Summer Program as a place that had started working on that. But I wondered if in your own background there were other organizations or other institutions that tended to operate more on that kind of a model that could have been drawn on.
I think, as a former Y worker,
YWCA.
Yeah, I think in fact, I think the best administrators in the world were the YWCA people and those sisters the Catholic sisters who ran hospitals. Mm-hmm. I mean, their administrative skills, and they really, the YWCA attracted people like Dorothy Height, tremendous skill in working with people, was on the national board at the time I worked there. And those women knew how to work with the community to be calm. And of course, they had to, because their very survival depended on meeting the needs of the people they served.
Because that was their whole definition.
Yeah,
of
that's
what
right.
they
And
did.
when I worked at the Y, I had to turn in a weekly report. How many people did you touch? You know, if you don't touch
Learning
anybody,
numbers.
you would probably. But I think, and the YWCA did work. Uh, I think the AFT, which was, I was more impressed with what the American Federation of Teachers did than I was with the NEA during desegregation.
Yeah, I think that they were quite far ahead.
Yeah, you know what I'm saying? So, I mean, when you look at groups, you have to say what group,
Mm-hmm.
and which one.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the reason that, the reason the NEA was more reluctant because it was dominated by administrators,
Mm-hmm.
whereas the AFT, was more, the control was more in the people, grassroots people who were part of the
Right.
organization.
Did black teachers in Atlanta have very much input into the local AFT chapter?
They have never been as active in the AFT as they have in the NEA. Of course, you must realize that this is not a union.
The NEA.
No, I mean the AF.
The
I mean,
AF.
this is not a union
Cl-
climate.
Right.
You
It's
know,
an anti-
up in New York and the Michigans and so forth, unions are more accepted. The climate in the South is that they are troublemakers, they are rude, crude people, and they believe in waving banners and striking and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
yeah. So people are not. I mean, administrators did not encourage teachers to join the AFT.
Mm-hmm. Would you
and
say there was also active discouragement of that by
I don't
administrators?
think it was active discouragement. I think it was more nonverbal.
Subtle.
Subtle.
Right.
It would have been unthinkable
Mm-hmm.
to tell people what, to join or what not to join.
If you don't mind, I think we'll work our way on to the YWCA since we were moving in that direction.
Okay.
Regardless. But I know you started your work with the Phyllis Wheatley Y.
Branch YWCA.
In 45, do I have that?
No,
right?
in 43.
43.
Okay. The last semester when I was working on my master's, I had completed everything but my dissertation, and I had done that by the spring of the year. And while I was waiting on the various people who have to read it, I didn't have any courses. I had passed all my exams, and I was recruited by the late Miss Irene Harris, who had come as at that time to serve as the executive of the branch, and she was looking for a program director to work with the business and professional and industrial women, and she thought that my background in education and programming was suitable for the work and this was a new position, and she wanted to try a younger person and somebody who didn't come with a large number of preconceived notions about union people and that sort of thing. And of course my first challenge that summer, my first summer of employment, was to go as a group leader to one of these YWCA conferences. And this conference was designed by the National Group for the Southern Region to eliminate the quota system of selecting delegates from the southern states. That is, each YWCA could elect one delegate to attend whatever conferences. But this was not true of the branches. The state of Georgia was given so many slots, and the branches in Georgia had to get together and select, the number of delegates that had been set up by the southern region. And so Miss Harris asked me if I would go to this conference, because she felt on the staff, I had had more experience in working with these kind of experiences. So I went. Dorothy Height was one of the persons who set the conference to eliminate the inequity of representation. And of course, they used a team approach. They divided us into discussion groups of 10, and we aired and tried to find out the reasons why these white girls did not want the blacks to have equal representation. And of course, we tried to agree on everything by consensus. However, after this experience, the experiences of resolving these conflicts, they had done it so much, they were quite quite skilled in it. But anyway, we were able at the end of that conference to have the white members to vote on one vote, for each branch by consensus. And of course, it living together helps too. We were all in cabins. We ate together. We played together, and all of this helped in reducing the kinds of fears that Southern whites had relative to Southern black women in that age category. And so it was a successful conference, and they just know how to do this. We role play. We do a lot of searching and that sort of thing, which are techniques that can be used. Case presentations and things like that. They used a lot of. However, following that conference, I had to return to Atlanta to run a summer vacation school. And the reason is during the summer months, the programs for your business and professional and industrial people just closed from, say, the months of June to August, because this is when they had vacations. So in order to earn our keep, we were set to various projects in the city, to work with the children. And of course, this was my first experience working with a group of children and youth between the ages of 5 and 18. I had, had the training, but I'd never had any work with them. And it posed quite a problem because I had been reared in a so-called middle-class family and saturated with middle-class values. The first day to me was a cultural shock. Because there was always somebody at home when I left to come back and say, did you wash behind your ears? Did you brush your teeth? Did you do all of these things that, mothers, it wasn't always mother, it was my auntie, grandmom, it was somebody to tell me that. Now these kids came to this vacation school primarily because they didn't have anywhere else to go. And generally, they were door key children. We call them today latchkey, but we call them door key back there. Their parents had gone to work early in the morning to travel by public transportation to take care of other people's kids and wash their houses, etc. And of course, the children often arrived hungry. They hadn't taken time to prepare the food that was in the house. They needed baths, and they had many emotional hang-ups. And even though I tried very hard to establish rapport, as I was saying, I didn't have to say anything. My nonverbal communication just said to these students who were very perceptive that I'd rather be somewhere else. And I lost the kids. And I really just decided, rather than to do a poor job, I went back to turn in my resignation because I had really blown it. And immediately Miss Harris, who was was a graduate of the Ohio School of Social Work, was such a keen administrator. She talked me out of it, and she and helped me to overcome my fears. And well, in other words, she just would not accept that resignation at that point. She said, after you do a good job, you can come back and resign. Of course, I had to acquiesce and set about to salvage whatever credibility I could have restored with that group. And they did really need the help. And I came back and assessed the situation. As I just said, my auntie was a principal, my other auntie was a teacher, and all of their friends were teachers. And I came back and just, poured, my problems and troubles. And I did realize that these students, children, needed to develop skills and self-reliance since they were in an environment where they were in control. There wasn't an adult. So I got called in all the favors of my family, and I got resource people whom I had known from way back. And one of the most important persons I called on was Miss Dorothy Flemister, who was a public school nurse who taught at Washington High School. And she came out and helped them to relate personal cleanliness with getting a boyfriend and brushing your teeth with holding them and so forth. She was very skilled at it, and that did help to reduce some of the odor. And having been a home economics major, I went and found some of the some things that talked about the importance of nutrition and the necessity for a breakfast meal. And I told them how to cook 1 egg dishes and so forth, and always try to have something before you come out, And I got volunteers from everywhere my mother knew to teach sewing and crafts and paper mache and everything. But anyway, to make a long story very short, by the end of the summer, like all the other directors, we came up with a culminating program at which time the parents attended and the children participated and displayed what they had gained as well as displayed the objects they had made. I guess the greatest lesson I learned was you can turn a disappointment to a positive appointment, but it takes a lot of effort and work and recognition that you needed help, and you didn't want to be a failure. And also, I guess it was a sign of kind of victory for me to eventually win those students over, because the beginning had been so horrible. I guess the crowning experience of all of that was when I came back to Clark in 1949, about 3 years afterwards, a young lady walked up to me during freshman registration and introduced herself. She said, "You remember when you were working with us at Herndon Homes? I told you I'd make it, and here I am." And that was really a reward. I'm sure some others, might have, but just this one came up to me and recognized the importance. Now, also during my Y experience, if I can continue to talk about that, Auburn Avenue during the 40s was just the hub of black entrepreneurship. And of course, they employed many secretaries, bookkeepers, etc. in these businesses. Black women could not belong to such groups as the League of Women Voters, the Junior League, and other groups, which provided a forum for discussing women's issues. And Miss Harris, who was my boss, called the members of the Adult Education Committee, which was my immediate who were my immediate supervisors, and aired the possibility of using the lunch hour on Auburn as a vehicle to sponsor programs for these business and professional women. The idea caught fire, and since the YWCA was not close enough in proximity for these workers to attend such gatherings on their lunch hour, she contacted Mr. Warren Cochran, who was the secretary of the YMCA at that time. He agreed to let us meet at this facility. We prepared box lunches and sold them for a very minimal fee. Speakers on political issues, fashion consultants from Riches, educators, controversial speakers, and all were invited to these noon hour meetings. And this contributed to the popularity of them. In 1950, the Phyllis Branch YWC had moved to its place on Mitchell Street. Other women groups were forming, and gradually inducting some few black women into them. And both Mrs. Harris and I had left the city. All of these factors contributed to the demise of this program. However, in my last conversation with Miss Harris before she met an untimely death in an automobile accident in Virginia, she told me, she said, well, I'm glad that our model was so good that the YMCA kept it going in the form of the Hungry Club. She said that's okay. And she said, but also it does show you how important it is to have your own facilities. So you can keep your programs yourself.
Keep the credit for yourself too.
But I even go today, and I think it has served its purpose, and it still continues to be a very effective forum.
I'm just curious, was it when you and Irene Harris were first working on it, was it called the Hungry Club at that time?
No, we just called it a noonday lunch.
Didn't even have a name.
It didn't even have a name. We just saw a need.
Right.
And
and just people from up and down Auburn
Avenue, who were the
women.
offices. The men could come too.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember they didn't make much money, and I remember going up to Riches getting this fashion consultant, which was a very popular, to come out and show them how they could take a costume and use different accessories, and how you didn't have to buy new clothes for every season. And we were always trying to see people who would come,
Mm-hmm.
and help, because they really did not have. I mean, they were not making, but they were all anxious to look good and proper pimp.
Were there discussions of the? I tend to think when I hear about the Hungry Club that they would often have very political.
Oh
kinds of
yes, we
discussions.
would have, for example, not only political. There was a guy named Dr. Mason who used to be with the health department, and there were many women's diseases and so forth that you would just had been brought up to even you just didn't even whisper the words. And he would come, and he would talk about the health issues and what women should do at the various stages of the growth and development. If there were political candidates who desired to come and share with the group what their platform and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
There were educators who came to talk about some of the problems in education. But it was a wide variety of topics and discussions based on the kinds of needs expressed by the members who were in the organization. That we would ask them what would some of the things that you want to see happen in these forums. Of course, I guess the YWCA did have tremendous influence on my philosophy of teaching. First, historically, and to a great extent, I'm getting back into this school administration model, working from the top down. And I remember that was another model that we had used in making program decisions by collaboration with those whose lives a program will impact. And I suppose the only reason the forefathers established compulsory education was because they assumed that the children wouldn't go to schools voluntarily. And I do think that because of this, I guess, built-in set of clients, that teachers don't always try to make learning life related, because they know they will always have, a captive audience. But having had the experience in the Y of working with young people who do not have to come to my program, it made me more sensitive to the importance of planning programs that are interesting as well as important to his school clients.
Right. I'm so struck by the story about the Hungry Club.
Okay.
I love that one. But in some ways, I have a more general question about the why. After that summer spent working with the Herndon Home Project, then I believe you did more work in the adult community.
Oh yes, so you see, during the fall,
Right.
we did. We only did that in the summer because a lot of for example, the secretaries would stagger their vacations during the months of June, July, and August. And, you had a different group and so forth, and it was very hard. So that's when the board decided that we could use our skills and go in and serve a need, because so many of those children could not pay to go to the recreational opportunities that were available, and they had to use, our services to set up programs for these students.
Right. Did you continue work with the Phyllis Wheatley Y, or once you began working full time at Clark, was that
No, see
less
what
possible?
happened. I married in 45. And my husband was a chaplain in the Army, but he went back to the ministry. And I moved, and I lived in Kentucky and Tennessee, following him around until we came back
in
49. So I enjoyed being a housewife, and I had my children. My children. I lost my first baby, and working with him and his activities in the church.
Right. I ask that partly because I know in many people's minds the Phyllis Wheatley Y is so influential throughout these decades, and I wondered if you had ongoing contact
No, see,
with it.
when I came back, I volunteered to work on the adult committee of the YWCA. I sent them students to work with their afternoon and evening programs, and Saturday programs.
So one of the things that you did while at Clark was to try to feed people over to the Phyllis Wheatley.
Yeah, the Phyllis White. And I worked, on the adult committee, in fact, for about 10 years.
What was the committee doing during those years?
Well, the committee was involved in, adult education. In other words, they sponsored programs in driver education, for women, how to fix a tire, gymnastics, and whatever the needs were. In addition, I did work in helping to train leaders in working in integrated settings and that sort of thing. Most of consultant work and that sort of thing.
Were you by any chance involved in I think of how the Phyllis Wheatley was used for voter education programs. I've seen references to the Public Affairs Committee, so that may have been different from
Yep.
your committee, involved in voter education.
No, our committee worked with, I mean, all of the committees, you know, would share with the programs whenever they had a program, but
Right.
my committee was not directly involved
Mhm.
in voter registration.
Okay.
And I think more of that was centered in the central YWCA.
Though at that time, and I'm thinking now of, certainly before 1960, I would say there. Am I right in thinking there were relatively few African American women who were involved in the Central Y?
Very few.
Right.
Mhm,
Right.
mhm.
So the Central Y was doing that, but not necessarily reaching into the black community.
In special instances, you know, if they had a great big meeting like the annual meeting, we were able to, to attend.
Right.
Mhm.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense now. I guess we have one last big topic to cover, but anything else you wanted to add about the Y?
No, I think you want to know something about these various institutions and organizations and Miss Ruby Blackburn.
Right. That was the last big topic we had agreed on.
Yeah, I guess as I look back and try to put this in some perspective, many institutions, and organizations were involved in politics. First, you cannot underestimate the influence of the ministerial alliances. Because the churches have always opened the doors, frequently to allow political candidates to address the congregation. They have encouraged membership to register and vote, and also took out memberships with the NAACP and held political rallies. I recall that as a young adult member of Big Bethel African Methodist Church, that when ex-President Jimmy Carter ran the first time for governor of Georgia, our pastor, the late Reverend Harold I. Bearden, who became a bishop, permitted him to address our congregation at a special meeting. And it was interesting because there was a bishop's son who was a member of our church who lived somewhere near the Carters in a small town, or they served there, and his name was Johnson, and he and Carter had played together, and he was the one that approached my pastor to see if he could get a group of us to, and I remember distinctly, it was the basement of the church, and he said, "I'm Jimmy Carter. I want to run for the governor of Georgia." So, I mean, not only our church, but I'm just saying all of the churches really were very, and the ministers themselves, they were the ones who rode on the trolley and sat in the first seats to eliminate segregation on public transportation. So they, and the churches have been. Second, of course, Atlanta University Center, faculty and students influence in the political life of Atlanta has been legion. I will just try to focus on a few of what I consider the most significant contributions. It was during the administration of the late Dr. Vivian Wilson Henderson, who was then president of Clark, now Clark Atlanta University, in the early 70s, established a public policy center as a part of Clark. Now, this center conducted and published several studies which focused on the impact or lack of impact of segregation in the community. Further, the center held a series of workshops throughout the state to educate the newly elected black officials in order for them to perform their jobs more efficiently. Some of them didn't even know anything about parliamentary procedures, but they had been elected to these offices. I suppose one of the most renowned alumni of this august group in the city of Atlanta was the late June Cofer. She was a committed and ardent worker for protecting the rights of all the children of all the people during her membership on the Atlanta Board of Education. And it's very interesting how she got into this effort to run. Her son attended Southside. It is now, it was really Roosevelt House, but it's now Southside. And he was having some learning problems, and she was very upset at the attitude of the teachers there. But believe me, the poor, whether they are black or white, are treated differently, from those who come from affluent communities. And she complained so much. Her husband said to her, "Why don't you run for the Board of Education? That's where the policies are made." And she did. And then she attended these workshops to try to get skill in performing the job. So Dr. Henderson was very, very alert, knowing that these people were being elected and nobody was helping them to prepare for the job. Now, some of the Atlanta University faculty members ran for and were elected to serve as representatives in their House and senatorial districts. Dr. Paul Bolster, who is now a full-time attorney, at that time he was a political science professor at Clark, was representative of this new breed of politicians who use their knowledge and expertise, in solving and trying to resolve political issues, as they worked as our representatives. In a course I taught entitled Introduction to Education, I always tried to synchronize the teaching of the unit Politics and Education with political campaigns, at which time students volunteered for extra credit to go down to the offices of candidates of their choice. At that time, when I was teaching, Marvin Arrington was beginning to run for office. He was a graduate of Clark and was one of the popular candidates in whose office the children enjoyed working. I think next, the college campus chapters of the NAACP, SNCC, SCLC provided a forum to train leaders such as Martin Luther King and Julian Bond of Morehouse College. Ben Brown, a former staff member for Jimmy Carter during his presidency, Billy McKinney, Ira Jackson, Carolyn Long Banks, and Marvin Arrington, all of Clark College. And the leadership skills that these students learned in this active participation was phenomenal, and many of them still play vital roles, as politicians and leaders in the growth and development of Atlanta today. And I think it was because of the organizations that we had that they could participate and learn and become skillful in the political process. And I guess one of the most beautiful marriages between town and gown at this time was a coalition formed between the Atlanta University Center and the Atlanta Constitution and Journal. The University Center asked a special reporter to be assigned to cover the summer school activities because the presidents believed that it would result in a more balanced and objective reporting, because so many times the only thing they got coming out of the colleges were the sit-ins, the boycotts, the negative, and of course it was necessary, but they didn't get any of the flavor of the educational aspect of it. And so the first person to hold this post was a guy by the name of Bruce Galpin, and I think he left Atlanta. He should be back here now working on some capacity. But he spent a great deal of time in talking to the people, working with Atlanta University staff and students. And by these special events, which took place during the summer in the form of weekly forums, not only did they feature outstanding faculty, but sometimes they were very controversial people.
Mm-hmm.
But since Bruce Galpin covered the entire series, the printed account was given objectively and fairly. And I thought at that time, I mean, after the problems began to dissipate, they saw no need, I guess, of keeping him on this post, but he was very good at it.
I would think that might have been one of the first time, maybe the first time, there was that much in-depth coverage of the African
Oh, of course,
community.
of the college. This was for for the Atlanta University Center, because even today, the good things that happen over there very seldom appear in print. It's only the negative. But when you have somebody who really, can really work in with you, and who is knowledgeable and knows where to go and get the facts, you know what I mean, it makes it much better.
And did he have contacts in the AU community to turn to for this information? Was he already well known?
We didn't know him until he got there. So, but he was a person who was very outgoing. He was young. He, I don't think he had the biases of, maybe.
I wish you would just take a couple minutes on your recollections of the work that Ruby Blackburn did.
My recollections of the late Ruby Blackburn was that she was a strong, courageous, creative black woman whose life was dedicated to improving the lot of her people. She was a domestic worker who later became a professional beautician. She worked very hard and at times sacrificially to improve the Atlanta community politically and in education. As a youngster, I recall how she worked with Hattie Rainwater, a white resident of Druid Hills, while she was president of the TIC Club, an acronym for To Improve Conditions. These two women worked to beautify the city by planting dogwood trees and crepe myrtles. Mrs. Rainwater worked in the white community, and Mrs. Blackburn and the TIC Club sold trees for a small fee and helped the people in the community plant them on the west side of town in this neighborhood we call Washington Park. During this Blackwood season, as I go up and down the street, these dogwood trees and crepe myrtle bushes are blooming at this time to enhance the beauty of our surroundings. You can go up, my street was not cut, but you can look over there in the street, see those dogwood trees, and up and down Simpson. She was an astute politician, being the first black woman to run for a post on the Democratic Executive Committee.
Which was in 1958.
I don't remember the year, but I know.
1958.
Even though she lost the election, it did not deter her ambition to become active, to continue being active in politics. As an ardent worker in the NAACP, she raised thousands of dollars for the organization and attended most of their national meetings. She observed the Atlanta League of Women Voters as a potential powerful political entity. Having been denied membership in the group because of segregation, she sought their assistance in chartering the Georgia League of Negro Women Voters. Under her leadership, it was a rare sight to see this group of black women seated in the balcony when the Senate and House were in session, lobbying for our rights and sharing the events on Capitol Hill with those of us who were working and couldn't attend these sessions. Before Reverend Sullivan established OIC in Philadelphia and Dorothy Bolden unionized the maids in Atlanta, this adamant black woman, a former domestic worker, knew how important it was to do a job well. Like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, whose ambitions for helping blacks were the same, even though they differed in means, Ruby Blackburn met the same kind of opposition from the black leadership when she chartered the Negro Cultural League. She was not opposed to blacks entering the professions, but she was a practical woman and knew many black women were employed as domestic workers. It was her belief, which she held on to tenaciously, that whatever job one held, it should be done correctly, and one should take pride in whatever they do. This required training, and the purpose of this league was to serve as a training center for domestic workers in order for them to become more skilled, demand greater respect, and earn the right to increased remuneration. Her faith in education was evident because as a former maid in the Atlanta public schools, she approached the superintendent and asked him to give the recently closed white school on Northside Drive near Simpson Street to her people because it was needed in the community. The white residents had moved out of the community. He consented, and the school was reopened and named after that stalwart black stateswoman and educator Mary McLeod Bethune. A more modern building has replaced the original structure, and presently it is located across the street from the new stadium now under construction. The residence her residence was about a block from being out of the city limits when she moved to Simpson Road in the 30s. Just across this railroad track, black students could not attend the public school, which was only a block away without paying tuition. Again, Ruby Blackburn came to the rescue of these parents and sought the help of the superintendent once more. After explaining the plight of these neighborhood children whose parents did not have income high enough to pay tuition fees, a small school was provided for them. Eventually, the city limits were expanded and the neighborhood children could attend the existing public schools. Ruby Blackburn, an outgoing, spirited woman who possessed tremendous intellectual acuity for her time and place in society, leaves the Atlanta community a legacy of hope, inspiration, and tenacity, which those of us who follow should uphold.
That's quite a testament to her.
She was a tremendous person, tremendous.
I wondered if you would comment in a little bit more detail about the interaction between her organizations and some of the more recognized ones. I know from speaking, with her daughter that she felt her mother encountered a great deal of opposition, and I wondered if you would agree.
I think, in fact, when she became a hairdresser, she became my beautician. Mm-hmm. So, I was there many times when she would, be talking as she worked on my hair. And she it was a sort of paradox. She had these ideas, but she knew that in Atlanta, where leadership was sanctioned because of credentials, she was reluctant to share too many of her ideas because she thought somebody would take them away from her and never give her the credit, which might have happened. So instead of learning how to work in collaboration, she tried to do it all herself, in terms of the leadership and so forth. And of course, it meant she would draw mostly people who were followers, rather than a mixture of some people who had, the education to help her. Her family, including Georgia, when she had, when she was having the schools, they would come up and help her, in the teaching, because she didn't always have the money to hire, outsiders to come in. And also, her human relations skills of knowing how to work was tempered with whom do I trust. And this was always something that plagued her and kept her at odds, with the what I call the mainstream Atlanta leadership.
I've seen in her papers deposited at the public library membership lists and that sort of thing, and I recognized a number of the names on there, and some of them I might think of as being part of that mainstream, but many names I didn't recognize. And I wondered if you had a sense of the membership that she brought into these organizations. And I suppose we maybe need to draw a distinction between the three big organizations that you mentioned.
Well, she worked hard for the NAACP. That was her lifeblood, and she helped them in recruiting members. She encouraged the persons that she worked with to become a member, and in that sense, she cooperated with them more, than the comparable support that they gave her organization. Now, when she had an affair, she was able to get the leading ministers to come, and the church people in the Episcopal denomination where she belonged. Her friends, like my family and so forth. So she did have a nucleus of people, even though they weren't active participants in everything that she did. They did give moral support, and they did buy tickets and and things like that
for her events.
Her events.
Right. There's so much that's been written about voter registration, voter education efforts in the African American community of Atlanta, and that's where I see the League of Negro Women Voters. She was entering into that. What do you think that what was her contribution in that particular area, would you say? And I think, for example, was she able to reach a different constituency than maybe other of the voter registration groups were able?
She was, but they weren't in large numbers. In other words, she reached a very different group of people than I would have. And the quality and the commitment and loyalty to her, you know, was almost enviable. But it was a small nucleus other than her work with the NAACP.
Which was right.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the opposition that she encountered, how much of it would you think was attributed to or complicated by the fact that she was a woman doing this work? Was that even an issue?
That was an issue, and also you must look historically. This is a university town, and particularly the black component, and credentialing was very important in Atlanta, and I think it was a combination of both. But had she had more credentials, you take Myrtle Davis, who was a black woman who became the president of the League of Women Voters, and who is now a member of the city council. Being a woman is a part of our problem. But an uneducated woman, I don't want to use the word I would say unschooled.
I also think too of the generational difference between a Ruby Blackburn and a Myrtle.
Yeah, because
Davis.
she came in at a different after. See, Ruby had done all this before.
Right.
You know.
Right. I have picked up on her close association with the NAACP, and that was fruitful, and that she
enjoyed it.
Were there other organizations like the NAACP where she enjoyed a good working relationship?
I think the NAACP, was the organization that she devoted, and of course, whenever she was a part of something, she wanted to be a part of it, which meant she wanted to go to the national conventions. She wanted to enjoy the total experience. And of course, many times she was never elected a delegate, so she had to, support herself. And she often took some of her kids with, and she took her own money. So to participate in a lot of organizations, from her stance, would require resources. And as I said, she was just a beautician, and they made nominal salaries. I mean, she wasn't in the high income bracket, and of course, her husband supported her, and he helped her go to these conventions and so forth.
I've gotten the impression that, at least with the League of Negro Women Voters, that it was very closely tied to her business, that she maybe even recruited members for the organization from
it was
her
neighborhood,
clientele.
Her clientele, and those people. Again, the people in her church were elitists and were, the more schooled people.
I'm forgetting, I know I once knew, what church did she belong
Episcopal.
to? But which particular, do you remember the
Now,
actual church?
she started with the St. Paul, and in later years, I think it's something about the Incarnation.
Okay.
The Church of the Incarnation is, I believe, on Benjamin Mays Drive or Cascade. It's in that area.
Okay. If she was apart from the network that was centered out of Atlanta University, did she work a different network of people to get them involved in the League of Negro Women Voters?
She didn't recruit or work any in the center. She knew her territory.
I guess I'm wondering what was her territory?
the neighborhood people,
Mhm.
the people, as you say, that she had, recruited as they became her customers.
So, very local in the sense of
Immediate,
close in proximity
that's right.
to her.
Mhm.
To her. Do you recall other women who were influential in the League of Negro Women Voters?
She was it. I mean, in terms of leadership.
Of
And
leadership.
I bet you if you would bring up the name, they would only remember Ruby Blackburn.
Mm-hmm. That's the one name that stands out. Yeah. Do you think that she was hesitant to bring other people on board?
Yes, her mistrust that, she had been crushed so much by the lack of ability to become a part, of mainstream
Mm-hmm.
Atlanta. She decided, if I can't go there, I'm gonna get my own,
Mm-hmm.
little lump of coal
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and build my own fire.
Right, right. I asked that partly because in the lists that I've seen, certainly there were women who were very involved in other.
Yeah, and it's like that. There was some of them, she would ask them to join.
Right.
They would pay the money, but
Mhm.
in terms of actively participating in the activities.
Right. I know that I recall Georgia describing just all the work her mother would do to put on an
Yeah.
event,
Mhm.
or to take a trip somewhere. Or
And
something
then
like
you
that.
see her daughter Frances typed very well, and
Mhm.
Frances would type the notices, the publicity.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So for some of the actual work of the league, she relied on immediate family.
Yes,
for a
right.
great
Georgia,
deal of
when
that.
she would have these social functions, Georgia, one of the persons who worked with her was a lady by the name of Ruth Duncan, and she was a caterer somewhere, I can't remember. She knew how to make most beautiful sandwiches, and she taught Georgia how to make these finger sandwiches, and also, and they would have, the people in the club would learn to do this, and this is one of the things that they wanted to introduce in the training center, so people could move from domestic jobs to become
Right.
caterers, which, was a lucrative
Mhm.
position. But she relied very heavily on friends. My auntie, she would recruit her to, my auntie, who was the principal, was always also the organist of our church. And she would recruit her, and my daughter started singing when she was about 2, and she would, ask my daughter, to come and be on programs, and my auntie would play for her. So, I mean, she used the resources of her friends.
Around her. Right.
Mm-hmm.
I just have one other question along these lines. At the very beginning, you mentioned her approaching the League of Women Voters, in other words, the white League of Women
Mhm.
Voters, and I actually hadn't been aware of that. So that's a real interesting.
I got that from Georgia,
Right.
and it seems that they did help her
Mm-hmm.
in getting a charter.
I see.
And somebody had to help her to go, who was politically astute.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure the males would have helped her do
Right.
very much.
Meaning, for example, the males in the Atlanta Negro Voters League.
Yeah, and the politically leaders,
Right.
who had their own agenda and so forth.
In their own organization.
But someone did have to help her because she really has a charter.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Oh, I've read the notices of it from when it was
Mhm.
printed in the Daily
Mhm.
World, yeah, and
Yeah.
that's able to establish the date that it was begun.
Yeah, and so somebody of knowledge had to at least help her in the steps.
to take to do that, yeah.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. we've covered so much ground that we can just leave it at that, but I wondered if you wanted to add anything to any of the topics we've talked about or clarify
No, I
anything.
would just like to say that the history of my people has been an oral legacy. And we're just beginning to write, in an insignificant manner. And I regret that some of the history of my family, was not captured before, they passed on, particularly the older ones. And if this is a service that will leave a legacy for those who come behind to do research, to know that Atlanta did not start with Martin Luther King, and there was life before. Not that I'm taking anything away from, anyone, but what I'm just saying, there was so much rich history in Atlanta that sometimes gets lost, because of our national hero, whom we're all proud of, but we want the whole
Right.
Story
And the context that
and
you
the
want to.
to be told.
Well, thank you for adding to that.